All right, we are continuing with our study in the book of Esther. We're getting close to the end. Not quite there yet, but we're getting close. So let's review just a little bit. Esther was present at the time of the Medo-Persian Empire. The capital of that empire was Shushan. The king was Ahasuerus. He was going to attack Greece. And he was very convinced that he was going to conquer Greece and then be part of his empire. He had 127 provinces, all the way from India to Ethiopia, but he wanted more. Anyway, he had a 6-month planning session with his leaders, followed by a 7-day drunken party. Anyway, at the end of that time, he wanted his wife Vashti to strut before the men. He wanted to show her off. She said she didn't want any part of that. So anyway, his advisors advised him that if he let that go, that all of the men in the empire would be having trouble with their wives, so he better do something about it. He divorced his wife. He divorced Vashti. Anyway, he went out and got defeated by the Greeks. And he came back, and guess who he wanted? He wanted a hug from Vashti. But the law of the Medo-Persians wouldn't allow him to do that. So he replaced her with Esther. Had a beauty contest, and Esther was the outstanding winner. She was an orphan girl, a Jewish girl. She was raised by her cousin Mordecai. Mordecai was an older cousin, and he raised Esther. Anyway, he followed her there in Shushan, and while he was there, kind of looking over things there at the palace, he overheard a plot against the king. And he reported that to Esther, and Esther reported it to the king. And the guys that were planning the overthrow of the king were hung. Mordecai's name was written in the chronicles of the Medo-Persian Empire. And that became a great thing for Mordecai and the Jews and for Esther. Anyway, the villain in the story is a guy named Haman. He was the second guy in control under the king. The king had promoted him to that spot, and the king said everyone should bow to him as they bowed to the king, and Mordecai, the Jew, refused to do that. Now, Haman learned that Mordecai was a Jew. There was hatred between the Jews and the family of Haman all through the ages, so it wasn't much to get Haman to hate the Jews. Anyway, he got a decree signed by the king to kill all of the Jews, and that was to happen on the 13th day of Adar. That was the last month of the Jewish calendar. Anyway, Mordecai put on sackcloth and ashes and became quite a sight there in Shushan. And he reported to Esther what was going on and gave her a copy of the decree from the king. Now, they didn't know she was a Jew. They didn't know her connection to Mordecai. Anyway, she was told by Mordecai that if she didn't go in before the king, she was going to be killed just like the rest of the Jews were. She would not escape the punishment. So she went in before the king. It was a risk for her to do so. They had a law that anyone that approached the king without him inviting them could be put to death. But the king held out his golden scepter to her, and she was accepted by the king. Anyway, the king realized that she was coming to ask for something, so he offered her everything or anything up to half of the kingdom. What a gift! Anyway, she invited the king and Haman to come to a banquet that she had prepared. And she brought him to the banquet, and the king asked what it was she wanted. And she said that she wanted and stalled. She stalled. Anyway, she invited both Haman and the king to come back to another banquet the next night, and she would tell them what it was that she wanted. Anyway, Mordecai met some interference with Haman met some interference with Mordecai on his way out, and he went on home and called his friends and wife together, and he bragged about what was going on, but then he told them about Mordecai. Oh, that Mordecai, bad guy. Anyway, he received the advice from his wife and friends that put that guy to death immediately. Now, he had already gotten this other decree. That was what Mordecai had sent to Esther, was a decree that declared all the Jews be put to death on the 13th of Adar. But he wasn't going to wait for that. He wanted to get it done right now. At least that's what he was advised to do, and he agreed to that. He had a 75-foot gallows built in his yard to hang Mordecai on. And then the next morning, he went to the palace with a decree ready for signature so that Mordecai could be hung from that 75-foot gallows. I don't know why you need to hang him so high. Hard to get him up there. Anyway, the king couldn't sleep. I got could written there, but he could not sleep. And so he had somebody reading the Chronicles to him. That ought to put him to sleep. But anyway, what they read where Mordecai had saved his life. And the king asked him, well, what do we do for Mordecai? Nothing. Well, the king said, well, we've got to do something to honor this man. And so he heard Haman out early in the morning. Haman, top advisor, he asked Haman to come on in and ask Haman what he should do to honor someone that the king wanted to honor. Well, Haman thought he was talking about honoring him, and so he told him to put on the king's clothes and crown and ride him through the street on the king's horse and shout to everybody that this is a man that the king wants to honor. Well, guess who he chose to lead Mordecai through the streets? It was Haman. Oh, what an embarrassing situation. Anyway, he didn't get his decree signed to hang Mordecai. But anyway, he did that, and he went home with his head covered so that nobody could see who he was after he had led Mordecai through the streets. The decree for Mordecai's death was not signed. Haman was thoroughly embarrassed. Anyway, he was still invited to the second banquet. So he could brag about that. He was invited to the second banquet. Oh, that's good. His wife says, if you're losing to the Jews, you better get out of this. Anyway, he went to the second banquet, suspecting nothing. He didn't know Esther was a Jew. Didn't know the relationship between Esther and Mordecai. Went to the banquet, and at that second banquet, Esther requested that her life and the life of her family be spared. And then she pointed out Haman as the bad guy that has done this plot to kill her. Oh, it made the king mad. Haman had really overstepped the bounds of his authority. And so the king ordered immediately that Haman be hanged on that 75-foot gallows. And, even in death, Haman was still somewhat of a winner because he had his decree. And the king couldn't change it. The decree to kill the Jews. So, anyway, he was hung, and that brings us to our memory verses. Remember, we've got hamburger memory verses. We live in the hamburger, and there's bread on top and bottom. That's what we're memorizing, is the bread on the top and bottom. But there's the hamburger in there, mustard and ketchup, pickles, and jalapeno peppers. I don't know who wants jalapeno peppers on their hamburger, but there's got to be some there, something that is really sharp. All right, here's our memory verse. Let's say this together. Psalm 27, 1 and 14. This is our bread. And the Lord is the light of my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the strength of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid? Wait on the Lord, be of good courage, and he shall strengthen thine heart. Wait, I say, on the Lord. It's an important memory verse, just fitting for the situation that we've got there. We're living in juicy good stuff, and some of the bad stuff too. But we need our one-word descriptions of each chapter so that we can remember what's going on in the book of Esther. Chapter 1, what was that about? That was about divorce. That's where the king divorced his wife. Chapter 2, women. That's where he had a beauty contest of all of the young virgins of the kingdom. Chapter 3, bow. Everybody was supposed to bow to Haman. Mordecai wouldn't do it. Chapter 4 through 7, we've got banquets. That's what we're still in this passage. We finished the banquets last time, but we're in the effect of the banquets. Chapters 8 and 9, which is where we're going to be studying in this study, we're going to be talking about the decrees, and that's part of the effect of the banquet. All right, Haman was dead, but what can be done? What can be done about the decree that he had issued? Esther was now known to be a Jew, and the king understood the problem. We're going to look at it in this outline, and I hate to give you so many points, but there's some things that just have to be discussed. We'll be talking about Mordecai. Then we'll be talking about Haman's evil Haman's evil lives, or Haman's evil lives, excuse me. That's talking about the decree that lives on. Then we'll be talking about happy Jews, happy land. And we'll be talking about time arrived, remember, and another. And you'll see what those are all about as we come through them. Chapter 8, verse 1. On that day did the king Ahasuerus give the house of Haman, the Jews' enemy, unto Esther the queen. Haman was going to hang Mordecai. Now his house is given to Esther. And Mordecai came before the king, for Esther had told who he was unto her. Now, this wasn't known to the king prior to that time. He had been honored because he had done a great thing, but he should have been introduced as almost the father-in-law of the king. He was the one that should have been asked the question, who giveth this woman to this man? Well, I don't know if they did that in those days. Anyway, Esther didn't request it, but now she owns Haman's house. He still had all of that money that he'd promised for killing the Jews. Think about what you would have done if you were Zeresh. Who was Zeresh? She was Haman's wife. And he's hanging out there in the front yard. I don't know how long they hung him, but she saw him hung there. Her husband had been 75 feet above the landscape, dangling there. She had sons to think of. She had 10 sons. She needed to think about them. What would you have done if you were Zareth and your husband has just been hanged out there? In one of my early Hebrew classes, many years ago, there was a couple, sweet couple. They were an elderly couple, but they had been separated during the Holocaust. They lived in Germany. They'd been both taken off to camps and separated from each other. After the war, they didn't know where each other were. And just by chance, no, by God's direction, they found each other. But one of the younger students in the class asked, "Why didn't you fight?" And they answered, "How? With what?" They had no weapons. They had no jobs. They had no food. And by the time that they realized what was going on in Germany, they were so weak they couldn't fight. Folks, that's starting to happen here. We better watch our country. But again, think what you would have done if you were Zeresh. Would you have just stood there and grieved, looking at your husband hanging there? Verse 2. And the king took off his ring, which he had taken from Haman, and gave it unto Mordecai. Oh, my. This put Mordecai in the same position that Haman used to be in. And Esther set Mordecai over the house of Haman. Esther was given the house. Now she set Mordecai over the house of Haman. Zareth, what are you going to do? Anyway, Mordecai was in a position of high political power now, and he owned Haman's wealth. It's just like he had possibly won the lottery. But what's he going to do? Let's read verses 3 through 8, and you'll have to have your Bibles for this. So turn to Esther, chapter 8, verses 3 through 8. And Esther spoke again before the king, and fell down at his feet, and besought him with tears to put away the mischief of Haman the Agagite, and his device that he had devised against the Jews. Now remember, the king can't change that law that he's signed. And Esther's asking him to do that. Then the king held out his golden scepter to Esther, or toward Esther. So Esther arose and stood before the king, and said, "If it please the king, and if I have found favor in his sight, and the thing seem right before the king, and I be pleased in his eyes, let it be written to reverse the letters devised by Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, which he wrote to destroy the Jews, which are in all the kingdoms, in all the king's provinces. For how can I endure to see this evil that shall come unto my people? Or how can I endure to see the destruction of my kindred?" Then the king said unto Esther the queen, and to Mordecai the Jew, "Behold, I have given Esther the house of Haman, and him they have hanged upon the gallows, because he laid his hand upon the Jews. Write ye also for the Jews, as it liketh thee, and the king's name, and seal it with the king's ring. For the writing which is written in the king's name and sealed with the king's ring may no man reverse. Now, understand what the king has just done. He has given Mordecai his ring, and he's told Mordecai, you go figure out what to do. I don't know what to do. You go figure out what to do and write a law and seal it to protect the Jews. I don't understand how a government can exist like that, but that's the way it was. Men make mistakes. They make mistakes in their daily living. They make mistakes in their laws. They make mistakes in their leadership. Still, Haman was winning, even in his death. But Mordecai's got the ring. Verse 9. You have to do this in your Bible. Verse 9. Then were the king's scribes called at that time in the 3rd month, that is, the month of Sivan, on the 23rd day thereof. And it was written according to all that Mordecai commanded unto the Jews and to the lieutenants and the deputies and rulers of the provinces which are from India unto Ethiopia, large place, and 127 provinces, unto every province according to the writing thereof, unto every people after their language, and the Jews according to their writing and according to their language. And he wrote in the king Ahasuerus' name, and sealed it with the king's ring, and sent letters by post on horseback, and riders on mules, camels, and young dromedaries, wherein the king granted the Jews which were in every city to gather themselves together, and to stand for their life, to destroy, to stay, and to cause to perish all the power of people and provinces that would assault them, both little ones and women, and to take the spoil of them for a prey. Upon one day in the province of King Ahasuerus, namely upon the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, the copy of the writing for the commandment to be given in every province was published unto all people, and that the Jews should be ready against the day to revenge themselves on their enemies. So the posts that rode upon mules and camels went out, being hastened and pressed on by the king's commandment, and the decree was given at Shushan, the palace. Okay, so what we've got now, we've got a new decree that was written by Mordecai and the king's lawmakers, and I had to stop here and explain a dromedary is a single hump camel, and they were bred for racing. So just keep that in mind. Anyway, the solution to the first decree was that was still in effect was that on that day, the Jews would be allowed to gather in the center of each city and defend themselves. And anyone that came against them, they could kill them and take their property. It was a risk that they were taking if they went against the Jews. Remember, under Haman's decree, the Jewish property was to go to the king. But here, under the new decree, the property of the enemy was to go to the Jews that killed the ones. So this second decree was kind of an interesting one. All right, verse 15. And Mordecai went out from the presence of the king in royal apparel of blue and white, with a great crown of gold and with the garment of fine linen and purple, and the city of Shushan rejoiced and was glad. You see, happy Jews, happy land. Okay, verse 17. And in every province and in every city, whithersoever the king's commandment and his decree came, the Jews held joy and gladness, a feast and a good day. And many people of the land became Jews. Oh, listen to that. Many people of the land became Jews, for fear of the Jews fell upon them. They converted to Judaism. Now, that's possible. You can do that. You can convert to Judaism. You can also convert to Christianity. Anyway, this is a huge change. The Jews are seeing that there's a way out of this death that they're facing. They can actually defend themselves without having to worry about criminal prosecution against them. And many became Jews in the process. It's a ceremonial process and so forth. Anyway, they wanted to join the winning team. This happened in the 3rd month. The battle was to happen in the 12th month. So they had a few months there that they could train and get ready for doing what they had to do. Chapter 9 and verse 1 says, Now in the 12th month, that is the month of Adar, on the 13th day of the same, 13th day of Adar, when the king's commandment and his decree drew near to be put in execution, in the day that the enemies of the Jews hoped to have power over them, though it be turned to the contrary, that the Jews had rule over them that hated them. The months had passed. The enemies still wanted to kill the Jews. They tried. Remember, there was no penalty for killing the Jews, and there was no penalty for the Jews killing those that were after them. So we can kill for free. Verse 2. And the Jews gathered themselves together in the cities throughout all the provinces of the king, of King Ahasuerus, to lay hand on such as thought their hurt, and no man could withstand them. Let me read that again. No man could withstand them, for the fear of them fell upon all people. And all the rulers of the provinces and the lieutenants and deputies and officers of the king helped the Jews, because a fear of Mordecai fell upon them. Remember, Mordecai is now second in command. His fear fell upon them, so for political reasons, they chose they better do it his way. Mordecai was known as the ruler of the kingdom. Not only did the Jews defend themselves, but the king's men helped. God can promote people. Remember Joseph and Daniel and now Mordecai. And we can think of some others too, but anyway, at least those. However, to all involved, this was just an uncontrolled circumstance. God didn't get credit for any of this. Oh, my. That's the way it goes. Verse 2 again. And the Jews gathered themselves together in their cities throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus to lay hand on such as sought to hurt, and no man could withstand them. No man could withstand them, for the fear of them fell upon all people. Verse 3. and all the rulers of the provinces, and the lieutenants and the deputies, and the officers of the king helped the Jews because the fear of Mordecai fell upon them. The Jews had to gather all day long because if they left the center of the city, they might be killed. Anyway, they were vulnerable to their enemies, but none of the Jews were killed. The enemies had no fear of government penalty because there was no penalty for killing the Jews. And that was the power of Haman's decree. Anyway, the rulers of the kingdom joined in to help the Jews. They had power to penalize those leaders if they didn't protect the Jews. Remember, Mordecai was in charge. Verse 4. For Mordecai was great in the king's house, and his fame went throughout all the provinces. For this man Mordecai waxed greater and greater. He was a man in control. I can imagine the Jews huddled in the center of the city and riot police all around them, keeping those others out that wanted to come in and do harm to the Jews. Verse 5 and 6. Thus the Jews smote, listen to that. Thus the Jews smote their enemies with the stroke of the sword, and slaughter and destruction, and did what they would unto those that hated them. And in Shushan the palace the Jews slew and destroyed 500 men just in the palace. Oh my, can you believe they would try that with what they had to go up against? Anyway, the Jews were protected. 500 enemies were killed. They got the stuff in their house. But think about how many Jews died. 500 of the enemy just in Shushan the palace. And none of the Jews died. They couldn't touch them. None of them were even reported injured. But some of the bad guys were named. Let's see the names of some of the bad guys. And Parshandatha, and Dalphon, and Ashpatha, and Porithah, and Adaliah, and Arodathai, and Param Ashte, and Arisai, and Aridai, and Vajeshatha. These guys are named here. Why do you think they named those guys? Think about what Zareth should have done. Guess who these guys were? Verse 10. These guys are the 10 sons of Haman, the sons of Hammedatha. The enemy of the Jews slew they, but on the spoil laid they not their hand. They didn't want anything that was Haman's. They didn't want anything at all that belonged to him. Dad had been hung 75 feet in the air, and the boys were going to go out and take revenge. They didn't get the point. Their dad was a villain. None of them would have existed even if Saul had done a good job when he was sent out to destroy the Amalekites. But God wanted them destroyed for this very reason. Zareth, the wife of Haman, should have taken a dromedary and gotten all of her sons on dromedaries, They were racing camels and moved her boys as far from Shushan as they could. She would have had some sons left. But look back at some earlier wisdom. Chapter 6, verse 13. And Haman told Zareth, his wife, and all his friends everything that had befallen him. And then said his wise men and Zareth, his wife, unto him, if Mordecai be of the seed of the Jews, listen to this, if Mordecai be of the seed of the Jews, before whom thou hast begun to fall, thou shalt not prevail against him, but shalt surely fall before him. Folks, this was just before the second banquet. It's just after Mordecai had been paraded through the city by Haman with great honor brought to Mordecai. But these were words from wisdom for Haman after he had marched Mordecai through the city. Zareth understood that they were in trouble. She should have done something about it, gotten on a dromedary, a racehorse, a race camel, and gotten out of there. She knew that the Jews were something special. There were several months between Haman's hangings and the 13th day of Adar, and still Zareth and the sons stayed there in Shushan. They should have gone. Anyway, the boys foolishly thought they were going to take revenge for their dad. Mama should have beaten some sense into those heads of theirs. We don't know how old they were, but Mama didn't convince them or even tell them, we don't know, what she knew. Daddy lost great power, that is, Daddy Haman, lost great power because he tried to fight the Jews. They all needed to get on their dromedaries and head out of Dodge. Remember the previous statements from the book. Mordecai speaking to Esther, chapter 4, first part of verse 14. For if, this is what Mordecai was telling Esther while she was stalling about going in before the king. For if thou altogether holdest thy peace at this time, then shalt their enlargement and deliverance arise to the Jews from another place. Now, I don't know whether Mordecai knew what he was saying here or not. God has something for the Jews to accomplish. He's not going to let them get all killed like other groups have done. The Jews have been run out of multiple countries. They've been slaughtered. Don't forget Germany. But God still has a purpose for the Jews. And even though God didn't get his due glory in the book of Esther, he maintained his promises. The Jews were protected. Back to Esther chapter 4 and verse 14, the last part of the verse. Who knoweth whether thou art come? This was Mordecai speaking to Esther. Who knoweth whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this? Who knows whether you are the one to rescue the Jews? Now, this was before the second decree was written. This was before Esther had actually gone in to see the king. But Mordecai recognized the importance of Esther's position as queen. Again, God didn't get the glory at that time, but I hope he's getting it now, particularly from us who are studying this book of Esther. Her physical beauty was not a coincidence. God made her beautiful for this very purpose. Who knows if your presence is not for such a time as this? Talking to Esther. And folks, we can also say that to you. Another. Let me just have a sip of water. You may not have recognized it, but that was a sip. Anyway, I want to tell you a story, and I want you to think about this story and think about the names of the people. You know who it is. Let me tell you the story, and I want you to recognize who it is. There was a young man who fell in love with a beautiful young lady. He asked the father if he could marry her, and the father agreed. Dark, dark wedding night, the father switched the bride from his beautiful daughter to his ugly daughter. You know who I'm talking about, don't you? The young man didn't realize it until morning. He was upset. But what was he going to do? What was done was done. The father allowed the young man to also marry the beautiful daughter, so he wound up with two wives. I hope you've identified these people. If not, let me identify them for you. This is talking about Jacob, whose name was changed to Israel. The ladies were Leah and Rachel. Each of the ladies had maids who also bore children to Jacob. Anyway, Rachel was the beautiful one and was thought to be barren. She didn't seem to be able to have children. Leah, the ugly one, and the various maids bore 10 sons to Jacob. Finally, Rachel bore a son, and that son was Joseph. He was the youngest, at least until his younger brother was born, Benjamin. And Joseph was hated by his brothers because his dad treated him special. And they finally sold him into slavery and sent him on down to Egypt. He was treated badly in Egypt as a slave. He was sent to prison for something that he didn't do. He was accused of attacking his master's wife. He had not done so. Anyway, Joseph was in prison for many years, and there he was able to interpret the dreams of some of Pharaoh's servants. And as such, when Pharaoh needed some of his own dreams interpreted, the servant remembered Joseph, and he was still in prison. And they called him out of prison to interpret Pharaoh's dreams. And, of course, Pharaoh's dreams were about the famine that was coming to Egypt, that there were going to be 7 good years and then 7 bad years. Anyway, Joseph became a great leader there in Egypt. And this is essentially the same story as we've got in Esther. We have the Jews being punished for nothing that they had done. Anyway, they were being oppressed. And God used them in positions of influence to do something special relative to the Jews. Also, you might remember Daniel or David. They were both in positions where they were oppressed, and not for anything that they had done. But the things looked bad in each case, and these men were promoted to prominent positions. The point is that God even controls the evil ones to bring about his own goals. God can control those that hate him, even to bring about his own goals. We haven't completed the book of Esther yet. We still got a little bit more to go. But again, we want to look at some of those what-if questions. I don't have those here with me. I went off and left them. But let me just think about some of them here. What if the king had not divorced his wife Vashti? There would have been no reason for having the beauty contest. What if Esther hadn't won the beauty contest? Out of 400 young virgins, Esther was chosen. What if Mordecai hadn't overheard the guards planning to kill the king? And what if the king hadn't accepted the word from Esther that these guards were planning to kill him? What if they hadn't written it down in the book of the Chronicles? What if a lot of the things that went on, what if the evil men had gotten through to kill the Jews? What if Haman hadn't been found out? Oh, a lot of what ifs. Also think about Joseph. What if Joseph had not been mistreated by his brothers and sold into slavery? All of the Middle East would have died out. We wouldn't have any wars there. They'd all died out. Well, maybe not. Anyway, what if the butcher and baker hadn't been sent to prison where Joseph was? Those were the king's servants. What if that servant had not remembered Joseph? What if they had moved Joseph to another cell where they couldn't find him? And what if he had not accepted his brothers when they came for food? Folks, we could talk about all kinds of what ifs, but I want you to turn around and look at your life. And look at the what ifs and see if you don't see God acting prominently in your life. If you don't understand this, you're going to have problems with what God told us in the book of Romans about salvation. Our memory verse is important to this study, but I want us to look at some things before we go back to our memory verse to see what God said about his doings in the world. It says, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who hold the truth in unrighteousness," just like Haman. "Because that which may be known of God is manifest in them, for God hath shown it unto them." God has shown himself to every one. Verse 20. "For the invisible things of him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made." By the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse, because that which they knew, or because that when they knew God, they glorified him not as God, neither were thankful, but became vain in their imagination, and their foolish heart was darkened. Folks, that's what happened to Haman. God is completely invisible in the book of Esther, but he's ever present. His name is not mentioned, but do you see him acting? Do you see these things as just happenstance? They just happened. Or do you see them as something that really did happen? Under control. Can you see God in your everyday life? You know what? You're probably not going to see him when something initially happens, but as you move on through it and turn around and look back, you need to see God, and you need to give him the glory that the book of Esther doesn't. I can guarantee you that he is ever present in your life right now today. Our memory verse is important in this study. Let's remember it. Psalm 27, verses 1 and 14 says, "The Lord is the light of my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the strength of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid? Wait on the Lord. Be of good courage, and he shall strengthen thine heart. Wait, I say, on the Lord." Folks, we're still in there with the pickles and so forth. There are things going on in there, and we need to know, top and bottom, God's got it all under control. I want us to see what God is doing in our lives. I want us to have eyes for that. I want us to know that God is working. So I ask you to look back, and even through times of disappointment, see God at work. Do you recognize that he worked a mighty work carrying your sin and mine to the cross and dying there, spilling his blood for our sin? Have you declared him? Romans chapter 10, verses 9 and 10 says that if thou shalt confess with thy mouth the Lord Jesus, and shalt believe in thine heart that God hath raised him from the dead, thou shalt be saved. For with the heart man believeth unto righteousness, and with the mouth confession is made unto salvation. Are you saved today? Do you know you're saved? Thank you for being with me.